welcome to another episode of Guiding Light. I'm Sierra Larson,
I'm Jenna Carson.
and today we're continuing our series where we get to interview Jenna on her healing journey and her story. And today we're going to talk about healing after divorce. So, last episode, we talked a little bit about Jenna's divorces and some details about that. So, if you haven't seen that episode, go ahead and check that one out first. And then today, we're going to talk about, her healing journey and her process. So, thank you so much, Jenna, for being willing to come and be vulnerable and talk about your experience.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I work with a lot with clients, as y'all may know, I work with trauma, and the definition of trauma, or what I see as the definition of trauma, is um, a negative event that, or sorry, an event that has negatively impacted the way you see yourself, others, the world around you. And in my definition, I include the way you see God. And so today I want to ask Jenna a few things about how her divorces has affected her in those ways and ways that she has been able to heal and maybe give us some tips or things that she has seen that has really worked for her that you might want to try. So, yeah, Jenna, where do you want to start?
Well, I'd like to start by saying that every divorce is different and everyone's unique circumstances need to be taken into account. So, any personal insight I share or advice, of course, should be taken with a grain of salt. And I just want to give a quick example of two very different healing journeys I had after my divorce. And then I know, Sierra, you had some questions for me. So, I'll just say that, like, after the first divorce, I was extremely shocked. My whole worldview had massively it had been upended. Things had been just knocked down, things that I believed. And a lot of my healing had to do with my self-worth, which I know we're going to talk about more later in this episode. But after that divorce, I took some time to kind of step away from my professional role as a chaplain. I had just finished graduate school and had expected to go straight into a chaplain residency at a hospital. And I did the interview and was ready to go, and then felt, you know what, this is not right. I felt very strongly I need to step back and take some time to do some deep healing work. And because I didn't have kids, this gave me a lot of flexibility. And so I was able to take about a year and house sit and pet sit and teach yoga and write and just really kind of go inward in deep spiritual practice alone. I wanted a lot of solitude. I wanted to be left alone with God and then work with people as I saw fit with my yoga therapy sessions that I offered. And so I did that, and there was a lot of judgment from others. There was a lot of questioning. I remember my mom's friend asked, she said, "You went to Harvard and now you're teaching yoga." And a guy I later dated, his mom was judgmental of my yoga as well. And people were worried, like, why aren't you doing XYZ? But I knew that I was doing exactly what I needed to do. And thankfully, I thank God for this. I had a mentor who had encouraged me not to listen to other people's opinion, to take them with a grain of salt and to do what I knew I needed to do. And I want to add that I had tried to be a military chaplain, but my church would not yet endorse me. And so there was a pause on that career desire. And so there were a lot of factors coming into play in my decisions to step back and do some inner reflection. And then I went back into chaplaincy, did a hospital residency, did prison chaplaincy, became a military chaplain. And so it's this quote success story. But before all of this outward success, there was opposition, there was judgment from others, and I had to work through my own feelings of shame around that, which we'll talk about. But before we talk about that, I want to just contrast this with my experience with the second divorce. So, with the second divorce, I had been married for a much lesser amount of time, but that was actually even more devastating for me. But it's interesting because I handled it completely differently. I was working in the prison as a chaplain, and work was my saving thing in my life. Like, I loved what I was doing. There was no question in my mind that I would get up and go to work every day. And for whatever reason, it was just exactly what I needed. It was a different period in my life. Now, I think I made a lot of mistakes at that time in my life. I was certainly not my best self, but I just got up and went to work because that's what I needed to do. And not that I wasn't working before after divorce number one, but this was a very different kind of work. And it was hard, but I just kept going and kept doing it. So I guess like I just share those two different experiences because again, every divorce is different. Every person's circumstances are different. And again, I want to emphasize as someone who doesn't have children yet, I did have great flexibility. So I know that's its own specific privilege, but I trust that each of us, like, we know what to do. We're going to have what it takes, the resiliency to do what we need to do after
Definitely.
divorce.
Yeah. I love that you talked about, trusting yourself, trusting, where you were being led. I think a lot of times we have really well-meaning people in our lives that think they know best about what we need to do, that are looking from such an outside perspective and are well, again, well-meaning, but sometimes, the best of intentions aren't received very well or aren't very helpful when someone's trying to heal,
Yeah.
and so being supportive might just look like, maybe not saying anything, if that's all you can do. Maybe just not say it and just say, I'm here to support you in your journey. And that's enough. So I love that you brought that out. Um, and then I love, like you're saying, the contrast between after the first divorce and the second. And I know that your book talks about a little bit more about your experience in prison chaplaincy. And I'm sure it does like a huge deep dive on that experience and what that was like in that time of your life. So that hopefully we're praying will be available for people soon to have more of that story.
Yeah.
If you're listening right now, just all thoughts, prayers, and whatever you can for that to be published so that we can all, really dig into that because we are so excited for that story. But
Thanks,
um,
Sarah.
yeah, of course. I want to talk about, I think you mentioned this kind of, your thoughts about yourself. Let's start there.
Yeah.
What were your thoughts about yourself after each divorce and where did you how did you change those thoughts and what was the process of coming to a new thought about yourself? And what is that thought about yourself that you have now?
Yeah. So after the first divorce, there was a lot of embarrassment. And there was after the second divorce too, because it's like, what? This happened not once, but twice. So a lot of embarrassment, a lot of fear of the judgments of others. And I think there was like shame. And I knew practices thanks to studies in mindfulness, meditation, and therapeutic yoga. I knew like to be kind to myself and to practice like positive mindset and saying nice things to myself. But it was very hard because I had grown up in this culture where, we talked about in the last episode, marriage is like the thing. It's really, really important. And so having the loss of that dream after the first divorce was really hard. But I also had hope. I had hope that I could still have a family that, I was and am young, and I thought, in my 30s I can still have a family. And but after and actually, I'd have to dig back into my journals, but I think actually my self-talk was a lot. I know it was much worse after the second divorce. Um, I'd have to go back to journals to remember what I was saying about myself after the first one, but oh, after the second one, I was just feeling so unwanted, so unloved because that husband had left me, right? Just a few months after we married, he walked out on me. And so I did not feel attractive physically, emotionally, or spiritually. I remember looking in the mirror and fixating on what I thought were imperfections physically. And I remember actually thinking like if I were skinnier, maybe he would have stayed with me, which is a totally irrational thought because he was physically attracted to me. I know this, but but I was so self-critical. And so for months and really even years, I was picking apart my perceived flaws. And finally, like 2 years after he left me, when I was still in so much emotional pain, I said, I have got to change something. And so I started doing EMDR, which is a specific form of therapy. I had done talk therapy before, but this was a specific therapy for trauma. And the therapist and I started diving into these memories I had. And there was this one memory, this stuck point of my husband pulling away from a hug that I had given him. And it's a simple memory, but this was before he told me he was leaving me. It was almost like I knew he was going to leave. Like we were saying goodbye one day, and I had hugged him very lovingly and affectionately, and I just felt him pull away. And like inside, I knew something was up. And then shortly after, he told me he was leaving me. And so, like, that was the memory my brain was having on repeat for years. And it was so painful. And it wasn't until I started doing EMDR that I realized, like, I have been reliving this memory every day for 2 years. And after she and I worked through that memory, I was able to let it go. And now I have to like recall it, because it's just not on the surface. But Sierra, I had so many things on the surface with him, so much hurt, so much pain of not feeling adequate. And it was really EMDR that made a huge difference because up until then, I had done so much yoga therapy. I had done talk therapy. I had done so much journaling, all the things that I knew how to do, but I really needed something to help retrain my brain and get out of those loops.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I think that trauma-focused therapy is so powerful. The way I describe it is, how do you cut down a tree the fastest? Do you start at the end or do you start at the root, at the branch or at the root? And I think EMDR, CPT, trauma-focused therapies really get to the root of why you're feeling the way you're feeling. What are your thoughts? What are the things that are keeping you in this cycle of trauma? And so I love that you brought up, that yes, your divorce was traumatic and traumatic or trauma-focused therapy helped you to heal. I love that. Okay. Let's talk about a little bit about, we talked about how you saw yourself. Let's talk about how you saw others and how you saw the world, which I know can kind of get, um, you're like, what's the difference between others and the world? So others are just like people that you know personally, like how it affected the way you saw people in your life or how you related to people personally. And then the world as a whole of just like for example, some people might have the thought like the world is a dangerous place or um, thoughts about themselves within the world of like I don't belong in the world. Hopefully, that's not a thought that we're
Yeah.
having, but like that's a real thing that some people have. So, what are some of your thoughts about others and then the world that you had after your divorces?
Yeah, well, I remember going to church after both divorces and feeling like I don't belong, because there were so many families in church. I remember hanging out with married friends and feeling like I don't belong. A friend had me over for Thanksgiving, and it was mostly couples gathered around the table. And I remember I was just trying not to cry because my thought was like, my husband should be here, but he was no longer my husband. Um, Everything felt really personal. Like, it's just so hard not to take things personally. And then like memories would just surface at the most inconvenient times. Like I remember I was at boot camp and it had been almost a year since he had left me. And I thought I had done all this healing. And there was a sergeant yelling at me about my boots because they weren't laced correctly. And I remember just suddenly, like, I wasn't upset that he was yelling, but I was upset because I like couldn't stop thinking about my ex. I remember I just like started crying and just couldn't stop crying. And then because I was crying, he was yelling even more. And so like I was so embarrassed and I wanted to tell everyone, like my whole flight, the other people there, I wanted to tell them like, I'm so embarrassed that I'm crying right now, but there's this inner wound that you don't see and that you don't know about, but I wasn't going to say that. And I remember the woman standing behind me because we were standing at attention in line at boot camp, and she was like, Carson, I don't know what you're thinking about, but you need to get it out of your head. And that's the thing with like your worldview after divorce, you can't get it out of your head. And
So,
and another worldview change was I remember I would like look at happy couples, like happily married couples, and wonder like when the shoe was going to drop, like when one spouse would walk out. Um, I'm embarrassed to say this. Like I would like seriously, that thought has been on my mind a lot since my divorces. Like I'll see couples and I'll just be like, "Oh my gosh, oh no, they're eventually going to get divorced." And I have to remind myself, Jenna, that's what's happened to you. It's not what will happen to them. And another thing that changed is I would start like just really inquiring, like, how do people have happy marriages that last? And just I saw it as like a miracle. Like, how does this happen? What is the formula? What is the trick? So I never had really had that question before because I just assumed you get married and you stay married.
yeah,
Yeah, so some unhealthy or maybe not unhealthy, just some different thinking patterns that I became aware of, and they're less loud now. I don't think about those things so much anymore, but it took some time.
yeah. I want to normalize that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like that. When you've had a traumatic experience, it opens up, you know, the way that you're thinking in the sense of like, I never thought this could happen. And now that it's happened to me, I'm assuming it happens way more often. And that's
Yeah.
so normal. I think that's so normal. And it doesn't mean though that it's always going to happen. Even though maybe the exception happened to you, that doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, it will happen to everyone, you know? So like, but that's something to work through with a therapist or, a healing partner or whatever that is, because that is a very, very common way of thinking after something traumatic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And then last one is how did it affect the way that you saw God?
You know, for me, it was this like really special closeness with God, just feeling very held by God. And I know this is not everyone's experience. I for whatever reason, have been fortunate in life to have kind of a rich prayer life. Like I have, again, I know this is not the case for everyone, but I have felt kind of strong feelings of communion with God from a young age. And so I've like in the dark, I'm not just talking metaphorically here, but also literally the dark nights of the soul, the long sleepless nights after divorce, longing, crying out to God, just feeling like God's the one being who will never disappoint me. And so there was this sweetness of feeling that closeness and being held and loved by God and being cherished by God and totally accepted by God. Now, this is something that has really changed for me in life. I used to be an extreme perfectionist, but divorce brought that perfectionism tumbling. It was a tower that came tumbling down because I couldn't live my quote perfect world anymore. I couldn't have the fairy tale. And I realized that no matter what I try to do right, I can't control all the outcomes in my life. Most of the outcomes in my life I can't control, right? So, so with my losing perfectionism, losing feelings of control over my life, I was able to actually more deeply surrender into the complete, total, all-encompassing love of God. And it's very hard to articulate that and that worldview shift because it has taken me years to stop being such a perfectionist and years to understand that God loves me, period. Like, I don't do something to earn God's love. God loves me, period. Um, but like, I just, I have been through this transformative experience of differentiating between my own, like, almost mania, like need to like do, and God's still small voice saying like I'm holding you, and it's still a journey, but it's beautiful. And honestly, like I can't I have so many moments where I'm like, this doesn't make sense, God. Like it doesn't make sense that you exist, but like I just can't deny that I feel this presence.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you bring up your perfectionism because I think sometimes, we have these thoughts of like, yeah, I have to earn God's love. God won't love me or he'll be disappointed in me if I don't do XYZ. And I love that you're saying like, no, it was in a time of the most that when you felt like you failed. The time where you felt like you had a huge failure where God was like, no, I love you. Right here, right now, in the dark, in your lowest moments, I still love you. I love you, period. Like, and it's not, and yes, he loves us in our high moments, but in those low moments too, he loves us.
Yeah.
It's unconditional. It's not a matter of like, whether we're disappointing him. We can't disappoint God. I'm so excited. I'm reading the book Is God Disappointed in Me by Kurt Francom, who we will have on the show soon. And I love how he talks about, God's never disappointed. He can't, that's not something that he has the ability, that's a human emotion to be disappointed. And so I'm excited to talk about that, but I love that concept in your story of how God was never disappointed in you. He loved you, in the moments where you were rocking it on your mission or doing whatever, just like the highest spiritual moments that you've had, and He's loved you at the low spiritual moments. And I think that's an important thing to remember is God is with you at every
Mhm.
moment of your healing. He's there to support you and love you. And so, yeah, I love that. I love that you were able
Yeah.
to feel that. So,
Yeah. I also wanted to share that just because I felt close communion with God did not mean that it was easy or happy. It was extremely painful. Like, I just can't describe how deep the pain was. And I remember after the second divorce, like coming home from work and I'd get ready for bed and pray and journal and do yoga and stuff. And then I'd get into bed and I would just howl in pain, like the very primal cries that would come out of my body, like these animal cries, these just mourning sounds, like and this again sleepless nights, and I was so embarrassed because I lived in the second floor of this home that like didn't have good insulation or anything, and like I'm pretty sure my neighbors downstairs beneath me could hear me, and I would just like cry into this pillow and like literally just be crying out, God help me. And so I just want to normalize that too, like for people like it's messy. Grief is not pretty. It doesn't look, tidy. And you'll have these moments where it just comes over you. But my advice is to like find your support group. Like all along the way, women would just come into my life, like strangers. Like I would just meet these women and they would be angels to me, like at work or at the grocery store or women I had known before. I just can't believe all the angels that showed up in my life and like mended my wounds and tended to them and held me and told me about their experiences of divorce. Like, I never in my life had understood the need for sisterhood so much until I went through what I went through. And I'm so grateful that I really believe God sent me all these angels. So when you feel alone, and you will after divorce, you'll feel alone. You'll feel like so many things, but the people in your life will hold you. And I know we don't just have women listeners. So you men who are going through it, like your group of male angels, like your brotherhood, I just truly believe that there's so much power in our communities.
Yes, thank you so much. I invite you to just, as we wrap up today, to um, take whatever you feel inspired by from this episode and make plans towards it. Maybe you look out look up a therapist, or maybe you look up a support group. Maybe you talk to a spiritual leader, or make an appointment with them. Just take one small step towards anything that you had felt inspired to do after listening to Jenna's story. So we just invite you to do that. And yeah, that's all we
And
have.
celebrate every win, every time you brush your teeth, every time you take a shower, every time you get out of bed and go to work, every time you make yourself food, like or take care of a child. Every little thing you do is a celebration during grief. So celebrate what you're doing. You're doing better than you think you are. And we're sending you all the love.
I'm Sierra Larson,
I'm Jenna Carson.
and we hope you follow the peace today.